In this episode, we will take a look at long-range transportation vision planning for the Washington metropolitan area. But first, we have our intersection of the month. We're at the corner of Fernwood and Democracy in Bethesda, which has been nominated for Intersection of the Month by Dick Joss. What sort of troubles do pedestrians face at this intersection?
Well, there's an awful lot of traffic going this way. It's like 10 lanes of traffic on Democracy, and so you got a long way to cross. But the real problem is that on Fernwood, there's a whole stream of traffic that backs up that all they can do is turn into the pedestrian crosswalk when they have a chance to do. They can't go straight through on Fernwood. So it's a kind of a race between the pedestrians and the cars.
So there's a forced left turn across the crosswalk, and do you have a walk signal?
We have a walk signal, but I have to cross like 5 lanes of traffic before I meet. So it's this 5-lane race, and usually 2 or 3 cars will beat me to the intersection, and then I sort of have to try to find a helpful driver who's going to let me cut in front of them while the traffic is kind of waiting. Sometimes they toot and beep, and sometimes they try to play a game of chicken with me, but it makes for a fun walk every morning.
Now, state law requires drivers to stop for a pedestrian in a crosswalk with a walk signal. What's become of that?
Some people are pretty nice, especially if I can catch the eye of the first driver waiting for the traffic light. They'll let me get going, but sometimes once it starts, no one wants to stop because there's a whole stream of traffic behind them, and I think they're afraid if they'll stop, someone will bunk them on the back end, but it happens.
Now what could the traffic engineers have done differently here?
There's actually an interesting choice here. One is they could have given the pedestrian a little bit of a head start on the walk signal. That would be one way. The other is that the traffic all turning left leaves quite a channel in there for a diagonal crosswalk. It would look unusual, but it's a potential candidate. You mentioned the idea of putting a little barrier or something out in the middle for the pedestrian to get partway across.
Yeah, that would be my solution, would be a refuge island in the middle and break it up into 2 pieces. So you're always crossing part of the traffic that's stopped and never have to actually cross an actively moving segment of traffic.
Yeah. Well, actually, the diagonal intersection or diagonal crosswalk does the same thing. Okay, you'd never have to worry about running into traffic.
We're talking with John Mason, who's mayor of the city of Fairfax, Virginia, and a member of the board of the Washington Metropolitan Council of Governments. What is the Council of Governments?
Well, the Council of Governments is the regional organization that has as its membership representatives from all the major counties and cities in the Metropolitan Washington area, Virginia, the district, and suburban Maryland. And we serve as, in effect, a coordinating body on issues of regional interest. And the COG board tends to deal with issues of safety, public safety, environmental issues, and there's a similar board called the National Capital Region Transportation Planning Board, which deals with transportation issues.
And what's the relationship between the Transportation Planning Board and COG, or the Council of Governments?
Well, the Council of Governments serves as kind of the administrative headquarters, if you will, for the Transportation Planning Board. The only reason they're not exactly the same is that the participation by the jurisdictions differs just slightly between the 2 different organizations, and that's frankly for sort of complex reasons that deal with what the federal law requires to be the membership of the Transportation Planning Board versus COG, which is a voluntary organization.
And you say the federal law has certain requirements regarding the planning board. So we'd see something similar to this in other cities?
Yes. The generic term is Metropolitan Planning Organization, or the jargon for that is MPO. And every metropolitan area in the United States is required by federal law to have a metropolitan planning organization, the purpose of which is to collegially and jointly work issues of transportation. The law mandates that the Metropolitan Planning Organization approve anything that has federal funding associated with it in that metropolitan region. So there's significant clout there because, as you know, most transportation projects of any size will have some form of federal funding.
Now, recently, there's this process been going on called Getting There. What's that all about?
Well, Getting There is all about looking at the future of the Washington region from a transportation perspective. We have a formal process that deals with the sort of here and now type of projects. That is, we have a document called Transportation Improvement Program, which deals with projects over the next 4 or 5 years, and we go through a process every year approving that list. Then there's another document that's called the Constrained Long-Range Plan that looks out about 20 years. But as implied by the word constrained, that document must also be constrained by what's financially feasible, meaning you have to have some notion of a source of funding before you can include projects in the document. So both of those documents are constrained documents. What we as a board were concerned about is how do you establish goalposts that define what general direction you want to move in over a longer period of time. What's your vision for the transportation for the region? So what getting there is really all about is establishing some visionary goalposts, perhaps out 40 or 50 years, that give us a sense of direction for the region's transportation planning beyond the constraints of the formal planning.
And a little bit about the nuts and bolts. What's been going on so far with the Getting There process?
The Getting There process has been defined as sort of a 3-step or 3-phase process. The first phase, about a year and a half or so ago, essentially involved getting information together and outreaching to the Washington community in order to get a sensing for what the facts are, to understand the transportation issues, and to get a perspective of various citizens and interested groups in what direction we should go. Then the second phase, which was completed by last fall, involved 3 task forces that developed alternative scenarios that might be the guidelines for the future transportation planning. The third phase, we're in the midst of right now, is taking those 3 task force reports, or ideas, plus ideas from various other groups, like the Board of Trade, environmental groups, and so on, and trying to broaden the range of alternatives that we might look at as we go through another round, perhaps this summer and fall, of public outreach. That will then lead, hopefully maybe in the fall or winter, to developing a consensus document that would be the document that describes what the region generally agrees to as being the vision for the future.
And at one point, the plan was to have the public in some way express a preference or vote on the 3 task force reports. Is that still going to happen?
Vote may not be quite the right word to use. There certainly are some who have participated in the process who feel that the 3 task force reports that were completed by last fall should be put out, if you will, for a vote. There are other areas in the country where that's been done by using, for example, ballots in newspapers and so on. I think those of us who are elected officials who sit on the Transportation Planning Board felt that there were a few additional data points that needed to be gathered before we put those out for discussion, so that the debate about them would be an informed debate, not simply an emotional reaction to 3 different perspectives. So our view was that it was very important to ensure that the public, in addressing any of the transportation alternatives, would have the necessary background against which they would be able to base their judgments. And that means, in our region, for example, thinking about the unique forms of governance, the differences between Maryland and Virginia, for example. Maryland is what is known as a home rule state, meaning, generally speaking, local jurisdictions have significant authority unless it's denied to them. Virginia, very different, is what's called a Dillon rule state, meaning the local jurisdictions, the cities and the counties, have only the specific authority that's granted to them by the General Assembly. That means, for those of us from Virginia, we can't agree in a regional context to things which we have not been specifically authorized to deal with. That comes to the nub, for example, in doing cross-jurisdictional taxations and so on. So we felt that it was very important as we go into this final stage, stage 3 of this overall visioning process, to ensure that not only were the alternatives available, but the backdrop against which we would have to make those decisions would also be exposed to the public.
And then once the consensus plan has been reached, maybe later this year, beginning of next year, how will that visionary plan fit in with your other planning process?
That's a good question. What we envision at this point will happen is that when we get to agreement on a vision for the Metropolitan Washington region, it will go out for public comment, as I mentioned a moment ago, and then it will come back and perhaps be modified as a function of the public outreach and comments, and then it will be formally adopted at some stage by the Transportation Planning Board, which means it will be a formal plan of the region, and I've often referred to it as it'll set the goalposts, kind of like a football analogy here, that you want to move toward. And we will then try to think in terms of how the constrained long-range plan moves toward achieving that vision. So it will end up as a formal adopted document of the region, meaning that we will be sensitive to moving in that direction.
Now, at this last meeting you had, where you presented the current status of things to the participants at Union Station, COG was validating parking tickets for people who drove, but doing nothing for people who'd taken mass transit. Is this symbolic of the sort of subtle bias that can creep into the system without us being aware of it toward automobiles?
I think that's a fair gig, quite frankly, and I think we made a mistake. The reason that the automobile parking was validated is that typically automobile expenses or parking expenses for meetings are often validated by the organization that does that. And I think really what happened here, it was in a sense perhaps the subtle bias that you suggest, that there's the natural tendency to think about that, but not necessarily the Metro. Clearly in the context of what we're doing, we ought to be encouraging transit. In fact, one of the reasons, interestingly, that we picked Union Station for holding the meeting was that it would afford the opportunity for folks to arrive by transit. So there was a little bit of irony there in what we did, and I think next time around we'd do it differently.
Okay. We're talking with Jeff Blum, who chaired the Quality of Life Task Force as part of the COG Vision Planning effort. What were the major ideas that the Quality of Life Task Force incorporated into their report?
We want the region to grow gracefully. This region is growing very quickly, and we felt that it was really important to find a way that growth is something that will leave a beautiful place for our children and our grandchildren. So we had three basic principles. One is that we want to make the wisest use of our environmental and economic resources. We want efficiency. The second is that we want to concentrate the growth in places where it's manageable, in centers, little cities, rural villages, big cities, town centers, so that's kind of the general direction that we were taking. Now, we have many specific approaches to that, and they are often embodied in our third basic point, which is we want to give people choices. We think that everyone in this region ought to have more than one good choice about how they get to work, to shopping, to healthcare visits, to visit their family, etc.
Now, there were two other reports or task forces that created reports, the economic prosperity and the access to opportunity. How would your approach compare with theirs? There were a lot of things in common, but what would be some of the differences be?
Well, first of all, let me say that we believe that our report embodies the highest quality of life, the highest access to opportunity, and the highest economic prosperity, and that you can't separate them. To be honest, those weren't names that we chose. Those were names we were given, and we didn't really like them. But if you had to identify differences, I'd say here's a couple. One is that the Economic Prosperity Group in particular felt that because we have a pattern of moving farther and farther away between work and home, what's often called sprawl, that you have to service that pattern. That's where people are. You can't be punitive toward them. Secondly, and we feel that people go where they go partly because the government sets it up to make one or another a cheaper place to go. There's a reason why housing is cheap at the fringe of this region and expensive in toward the center, and then gets cheap again in the district. That's not the case everywhere in every city in America or the world. It has to do with a pattern of incentives and disincentives that the government gives. And so we think it's time for the government to say, here's what best expresses the public interest. Not to do it without consultation with the public, but to do it after broad public discussion. And the second thing that we feel that distinguishes ours is that we had some very concrete goals and timetables. So for example, we said by the year 2000, which is not that long from now, this region ought to decide what are the 3 highest priority corridors that it believes need to be invested in so that people have choices how to travel in those corridors. Big, high traffic corridors like across the Wilson Bridge between Maryland and Virginia. And let's not shilly-shally around. Let's identify those corridors, let's figure out what the improvements are, and then let's begin making those improvements. We can't plan forever, it's time to act.
And one of the problems we have in this region is we have 2 states and a district, a lot of local municipalities and counties that have a lot of independence. How do you get the people to cooperate when perhaps each jurisdiction wants to have its own center with its own tax base with economic growth? How do you fit that into our plan?
Well, there's no simple answer to that, John, but the reality is that people, although we live in a particular jurisdiction, we may work in a different one, our family or our shopping may be in another one. I don't think people are as rooted in the politics of their individual jurisdiction as some of our elected officials sometimes are. And so we say, let's, within the limits of each county or city, setting what its priorities are, let's set some regional priorities. Let's do them with broad public discussion, and then let's move on them. And success breeds success. Just for example, it's crazy that in this region you can't have one fare to get on a bus in Fairfax County and get off the metro in Montgomery County and then maybe even get on another bus. You ought to have one simple fare. It ought to work for every type of transit that you could take. There's no reason why that can't happen. The technology is there. It's happening in other regions. Let's begin to have an experience of cooperation, and success will breed success.
And all 3 reports talk a lot about the importance of improving things for pedestrians to make it possible to walk or to bicycle to nearby destinations. The quality of life report perhaps more so than some of the others. Why are pedestrians crucial to transportation?
Well, first of all, of course, virtually everyone is a pedestrian, often, in their trip to work. They're walking 3 blocks from a parking lot, they're walking 5 blocks to the metro, whatever it may be. If we are going to win people over to the notion that you can have a little more density, more Bethesdas, more Silver Springs, more Fairfax cities, more Alexandrias in this region, that density is not a bad thing that we should run away from. You've got to make the places that are more dense truly attractive. And that means if they have a transit stop, we're standing here by Bethesda Metro, it's got to be really easy to walk to that transit stop. The lights have to be timed. There have to be crosswalks for the pedestrians. You have to feel safe, whether it's me with my 11-year-old daughter feeling safe or my mother who's 75 feeling safe. Every level has to feel that the transportation system works for them. Right now we have a transportation system which favors the car. And some people would say, well, most people are in their car. Well, again, most people are in their car, and a huge percentage of people bike, and virtually everybody walks, and on trips to work in this region, something like 30-some% going into Washington on the work day take transit. We have to have transportation systems that reflect the diversity of people's experience. And when we give them high quality systems, and when they can walk feeling safe, when they can be on a bike path so that they don't have to cross incredibly busy 6-lane streets in an unsafe way. When the bus is timed so that if you get off the metro, particularly off-peak, you can feel confident that there'll be a bus there within 5 or 8 or 12 minutes. Then we have a chance for people to feel, well, yes, I can use multiple choices. And then we won't all be stuck on the Beltway and we won't all be stuck on 66. We'll be able to choose, and that will make the Beltway and 66 work better. So everybody benefits.
And the 3 reports are rather long. They're 20, 30, 40 pages long. If we wanted to bring this information to the public and let the public express which of the visions represented their idea for the future, how can you deal with these long reports, getting the ideas out to the general public who don't have time to read that much paper?
Well, obviously, that's part of the job of advocates and planners and political figures, is to boil this down. There was a poll that was taken at the beginning of this process that showed quite clearly that people in this region feel it is a higher priority to spend money improving our transit system than our roads. Not that we should ignore the roads, but the transit has to come first in the next round of planning, because we've built out the vast majority of all the roads that we need. Now we've got to make transit work. Think of it as a spider web. We've got to be able to go north, south, east, and west on transit just as you can on a road. And in the smaller areas, in the town centers, near the shopping areas, near the schools, you got to be able to walk and bike there very, very safely and easily. We're going to have to go out and educate the public. Your show's a terrific example of the kind of thing that should be happening more. We need to engage the media in this. Political figures need to be willing to take the risk to go out and say to your constituents, hey, we have some real choices to make. We can do X, Y, or Z, and they're going to cost X, Y, and Z. Now let's try to figure out what's the best match that we want. And then we got to put it together with visionary leaders who are willing to stand up and say, I know what's going to be right, my constituents have spoken, the region has spoken, and we're going to go out and we're going to do it whether it's easy or hard, but we're going to move forward so that this region grows gracefully and beautifully into the 21st century.
We're talking with Kristen Pauley, who's manager of urban and metropolitan programs for the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. What is the Chesapeake Bay Foundation?
Well, we're a regional environmental organization dedicated to preserving, restoring the Chesapeake Bay and the watershed that the bay occupies.
Now, what's the relationship between the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Washington Regional Network?
Well, the Washington Regional Network is just what it says. It's a network of organizations and individuals that are concerned about the future of the Washington metropolitan region, and in a way it's a subset of individuals and organizations that want to see the region grow in a healthy way, which will in turn be good for the Chesapeake Bay. So we've helped to incubate the Washington Regional Network, get it started, get it going, and now it's on its own and thriving.
Now, a few years before the Council of Governments started its vision planning effort, the Washington Regional Network came out with its own study. What were your conclusions?
Well, our conclusions were that the region desperately needed to think about the integration of transportation with land use. The two are planned and developed very separately, and the consequence has been sprawl, traffic congestion, a deteriorating environment, problems for the economy, and it really is a solution or a set of solutions who have proven to be false. They just don't work. And so we looked at the problem and we said the only way that we're going to start to have a better system is by reorienting toward communities, toward integration, toward multimodalism. And so that was the central vision behind a new approach, which was our document.
And there were 4 main points that you made in the document. What were those?
Well, the first was that it should be possible to live and work in this region with one car or no car. That, if you start with that premise, then a whole series of other considerations follow. Then there's much more opportunity for walking, for biking, for renting cars when you need them, and using public transit. And all of those other modes of transportation have been significantly short-sighted, short-changed in the transportation planning of the last 40 years. It's been all automobile dominated. So we are saying, if you really choose to work from a community perspective, try to direct some of the growth into the existing communities. That was the second premise, to, as we look toward the future, we look toward growth, rather than having a whole set of public policies that make it much easier for growth to go in the outlying counties. Let's find the incentives that will move them into centers along the existing metro system, or in clusters that can be easily served by transit.
So take advantage of the infrastructure that we've already spent so much money to build.
Exactly, and that's the third point, that we've already got a fantastic metro system. We've got a really good network of highways with a few improvements, and with a commitment to the community aspect of it, we could take much better advantage of those facilities. It might mean some congestion pricing, some pricing of parking, but those are, if they're all done as a whole, the impact on the region will be far better than just blindly building roads that will become congested again.
And your final point?
Our final point is that we really need a regional management system, some kind of financing capacity for a regional transportation system.
Now, you drew up this document with the Washington metropolitan area in mind. Do these same principles apply elsewhere?
Oh, of course. And in fact, we've been in touch with groups in Portland, in Chicago, in North Carolina, all across the country that are seeing the same problems and coming to the same conclusions. The mentality of designing everything for the automobile really, we think, is outmoded, and that we're in a new era where we have to be more thoughtful about how we manage and create the systems that we use, but that the long-term impact is going to be far greater.
Visit us on the internet at www.pedestrians.org.